Don't run.
Don't run away, right?
It's for you guys, and
Just say rights for human.
Rights for you.
Simple that way. Is it not a good answer?
I don't know anything about human rights.
Human rights are rights that everyone should have simply because they are human.
Human rights are human rights. They're on the constitutional book, and then what else? It just tells you what you can do and what you can't do.
Human rights for me is like you as a person to just have the basics like water, food, a house to live in. Just human rights for you as a human to live.
Everything that defines being a human. Like I am properly dressed, I'm alive, I'm well fed, I'm healthy, I'm sane, those things. Everything that defines a human being is human rights.
As a foreigner in South Africa, I'm aware that I have rights, but the only rights that I don't have is to vote in South Africa, because I'm a foreigner, I don't belong here, I belong from another country.
So human rights for me is just like the basic rights that you have as a human being, whether you are male, whether you are female, that the equal amount of rights that we have.
I don't know what human rights are, but I know that they are there for the people's protection, and then human rights are also there to guide people on what they are entitled to, and also just general protection of the public and its rules, and also the constitution, how they react to those rights when people come up with complaints and stuff.
As a human being, people have got our rights as a human being that must not be abused by any person. It's our right to live freely, not being afraid of anyone as a human being.
Human rights are those rights that are accorded to every human being by virtue of just being human. So you don't have to do anything or say anything to gain them. Those are rights that you have by virtue of being born a human, and they're entitled to everyone. It doesn't matter what your race is, it doesn't matter what your gender is, it doesn't matter where you come from. Everybody is entitled to human rights, and they're particularly important because they govern the way in which we live with each other from day to day, the way in which our governments provide for us on social benefits and civic activities. So they're very important because they basically govern the way in which we live from day to day with each other. This means that they relate to one another and they depend on one another. For instance, the right to life. This is qualified by the right to have access to water, the right to have access to justice, the right to have food. If you want to have a good life, you need to be able to have access to basic services. So this is how they are interrelated, and this is how they're interconnected, and this is how they are interdependent with one another. Each of these rights depend on each other so as to be able to make sense to an individual's life. Human rights can be limited. How can they be limited? For instance, the right to privacy. If you have committed, let's say, a crime, you can be jailed, and your right to freedom of movement and your right to freedom of association can be limited. So they can be limited. And then there are absolute rights, which cannot be limited. I think pre-1994, there wasn't an acknowledgement, particularly when you look at South Africa, there was no acknowledgement of the fact that everyone is equal before the law and everyone is entitled to human rights. So that's why you found there was the policy of segregation apartheid, where you had white people who had seemingly more privileges and more rights over Black people. Black people were discriminated against. And but now, after 1994, after the Constitution, we now have a Bill of Rights, which in which it is enshrined human rights, basic fundamental freedoms for everyone, irregardless of race, irregardless of color. In my opinion, I don't think government is doing enough. I think they really need to do more. I think they need to step up their game, particularly when you look at women's human rights. You know, there's a massive violation of women's human rights when you look at issues of violence against women and gender-based violence. Women do not have access to justice. And that's a huge problem. They don't have access to basic services, even just health services, sexual and reproductive health services. So I think the government really needs to do more in that respect. They can do more and they should do more. I think it's sometimes the lack of will, lack of political will, lack of resources, lack of knowledge. I think those things contribute significantly to the lack of implementation of certain policies that would enable men and women and children to have access to their human rights. I think, like I said earlier, some of the reasons is lack of resources, lack of implementation, and lack of political will. Where in South Africa, we've seen our leaders who have, in certain instances, demonstrated a lack of seriousness when it comes to issues of gender-based violence. Only until recently, when we have seen with the Total Shutdown March, the Sandton March, and this is how we have seen the government being taken into account by ordinary citizens, ordinary women who have come out to the streets and called the government to account in relation to gender-based violence and in relation also to xenophobia. So it's been mostly a lack of leadership and a lack of implementation of the existing policies and legislation. There has not been as much support that we would like to see, particularly when you look at women's rights organizations and civil society organizations. There has not been sufficient support to ensure that, you know, women's rights are protected. And when you look at, for instance, the police, when a woman goes to go and report an instance of a violation, sometimes, or domestic violence issue, sometimes a woman is not taken seriously. When women go and report rape cases, they are not believed, or they are even turned back when they are at the police station. Those are some of the serious problems that we have, that we're facing as a country, that we need to address.